Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual public conference on the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance under the Biden and Suga administrations. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to have you all here for what is an exceptionally timely set of discussions on what lies ahead. As many of you know, this month has been a busy one for our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, particularly Japan. Shortly after the first ever virtual Quad Summit among the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin traveled to Tokyo for the first stop in their tour of Asia. I'm not sure anything underscores more the importance of Japan for US relations for the Biden administration than the fact that Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin made the stop there as a first one in their priorities. As many of you know, the joint statement that came out of their 2+2 meeting between Japan and the United States was remarkable for expressing explicit concerns about China's behavior and emphasizing the importance of the US-Japan alliance in our shifting geopolitical environment. Then, of course, the trip concluded last week with a tense diplomatic exchange in Anchorage on Thursday and Friday, 10 hours behind closed doors that underscored the seriousness of the challenges facing US-China relations, but also the seriousness of both sides' purpose in getting down and talking about real issues as well. This was especially clear from the US side in the domain of human rights, values, and democracy, with Secretary Blinken saying our relationship with China will be adversarial when it must be. At these moments, it is essential that the United States work closely with allies and partners to address the greatest opportunities and challenges facing the rules-based international system. And here at the Atlantic Council, we know that direct dialogue is essential to such efforts. That's why our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Asia Security Initiative, and I want to tip my hat to the director of the Scowcroft Center, Senior Vice President of the Atlantic Council, Barry Pavel, and to Dr. Mian Oh, who is the director of the Asia Security Initiative. Two better leaders you cannot find for this sort of work. They have brought together a group of distinguished experts and officials from the United States and Japan, as well as India and Australia, to discuss the future of both the bilateral US-Japan alliance and what's next for multilateral cooperative efforts in the region under the Quad. My hope is that today's session will help us understand the series of strategic developments we've witnessed over the past months and provide actionable policy recommendations to help the Biden and Suga administrations, as well as our friends throughout the region, meet the greatest challenges and also the opportunities we have moving forward. We are at the Atlantic Council, a place where our whole mission is shaping the global future together with allies and partners. The Atlantic Council does nothing alone, but always alongside partners and allies. And so for us, this sort of meeting is absolutely crucial to the way that we want to engage in the region and in the world. And certainly the Biden administration has made very clear that that is its purpose and its underscoring purpose of working clearly and strongly with allies and partners going forward. In that spirit, it is my distinct honor this evening that we'll be hosting Ambassador Koji Tomita, Japan's new ambassador to the United States, for opening remarks. We tend to get the best and brightest in diplomatic circles that countries are sending us to Washington, and Ambassador Tomita is certainly that. And he really captured the fundamental strength of our alliance when he wrote upon his arrival, quote, "When it comes to Japan and the United States, the most important things have not changed. Our friendship, our alliance, and the economic partnership. One thing that has changed is our relationship is expected to play an even greater role, and this is a continuation of his quote, an even greater role in the current security environment, as our solid alliance creates a strong foundation for regional stability. And that's really why we are here today, Mr. Ambassador, to explore what that even greater role, as you put it, entails across a broad range of security and economic, diplomatic, humanitarian, and public health issues. Before coming to Washington, Ambassador Tomita was most recently Japan's ambassador to the Republic of Korea and previously served as representative of Japan for the G20 summit and ambassador to Israel. I should also note that we are actually welcoming Ambassador Tomita back to Washington, as he served previously as Deputy Chief of Mission at the embassy here in 2012. We are certainly happy to have you back, and I know you're well known to so many officials at the top of the Biden administration who've worked with you so effectively in the past. Before I invite the ambassador to deliver his opening remarks, I'd like to remind everyone that today's session is open to the public and on the record. You can submit your audience questions via the Zoom Q&A function or via Twitter using the hashtag ACJapan, hashtag ACJapan. With that, it's my pleasure and honor to turn things over to Ambassador Tomita. Mr. Ambassador, to you.
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for that very generous introduction. And my warmest greetings to all the participants in the seminar. We at the Japanese Embassy have always valued the interactions with the intellectual community here in Washington, D.C., both for getting our messages across and for gaining inputs on various issues of interest. And the Atlantic Council has always been in the center of these interactions. And I'm particularly grateful to the Council for taking a very timely initiative in organizing an event which focus on a number of critical questions we need to address as we move into a new phase in the Japan-US Alliance cooperation. As you may have noticed, and as Fred alluded, in the very short space of 2 months since the start of the new administration, significant steps have already been taken in the alliance cooperation, foreshadowing, we hope, an even stronger partnership in the coming years. There have been very robust interactions through the framework of the Quad, both at the ministerial and the summit level. There was enormously successful visit by Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin to Japan. And now we have started preparation for a possible visit by Prime Minister Suga, which we hope will take place as early as next month. In my mind, all these developments are function of two things. The new administration's very strong focus on the Indo-Pacific region and its readiness to engage allies and partners in its diplomatic efforts. And we in Japan very much welcome both of those intents. And we are very eager to work with the new administration, fleshing out the concrete substance to our partnership in the coming weeks and months. It is in this process that the inputs from the seminar like this is so valuable, and we very much look forward to learning from the discussions today. So let me conclude by thanking once again the Atlantic Council for its initiative and wishing the meeting a great success. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and to all of you who have joined this evening for these important discussions. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm really excited to be moderating today's first panel session on the future of the bilateral alliance under the Biden and Suga administrations. Most of you know the alliance has been a cornerstone of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific for more than 60 years, but faces a very dynamic geopolitical environment today. We're in for a rocky decade. While our country's joint statement from the recent 2+2 meeting reaffirmed the fundamental strength of the alliance, it also identified the set of serious challenges facing the two countries and the broader region and the rules-based international order. Those challenges include geopolitical competition, the rise of China, COVID-19, which is not yet over, climate change, revitalizing democracy, the growing North Korean nuclear threat, maritime security, the Taiwan Strait, Hong Kong, human rights abuses in Xinjiang. These are just some of the major challenges that the joint statement itself identified. Fortunately, I believe the alliance is well equipped to play a leading role in working with other allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and beyond to tackle these challenges. And we have a fantastic panel with us today to help analyze the recent developments and provide actionable policy recommendations for policymakers ahead of the Prime Minister's upcoming trip to Washington, which the ambassador mentioned. This evening's discussion helps us to advance the mission of the Scowcroft Center, which honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in close cooperation with U.S. allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. As always, we're very happy to be working with our friends in the Embassy of Japan on these efforts. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to remind the audience joining via Zoom to send in their questions using the Q&A function throughout the discussion. And I've been asked to remind you all to keep your eye on the chat for the link to join the second panel discussion at the end of this one. With that, I'd like to introduce our three distinguished panelists. First up, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Korea and Japan, Mark Napper. Mr. Napper has just returned from the 2+2 meetings last week, and he has served in his current position since August of 2018. Prior to assuming this position, he was in Seoul as the charge d'affaires from 2017 to 2018. He was DCM from 2015 to 2016 and had a wide range of earlier assignments across the region and as well as in Baghdad. Next, we will have Dr. Toshihiro Nakayama, Professor of American Politics and Foreign Policy in the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. Dr. Nakayama is also an adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, and among a number of prestigious positions, he has been at Brookings, the Center for Strategic Studies, and the Wilson Center. And we have Dr. Sheila Smith. We're really honored to have her here. She is Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert on Japanese politics and foreign policy and author of numerous books, including Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics, and A Rising China, as well as Japan's New Politics and the U.S.-Japan Alliance. So unbelievably qualified for this discussion. We're really thrilled. So thanks to all three of you for joining our discussion. I'd like to begin by asking each of you for your initial thoughts on the last week's momentous developments, the Blinken-Austin trip to Asia, particularly the 2+2 joint statement, and the tense open U.S.-China diplomatic exchange in Alaska. Perhaps I'll start with Deputy Assistant Secretary Napper, and thank you again, Mark. It's wonderful to see you.
Well, thank you, Barry, and thanks again to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. It's always great to be here, and yes, it's great to be here to be able to talk about last week's, as you said, really historic, momentous trip to the region by Secretaries Blinken and Austin. And I appreciate the kind words about the 2+2 statement. As folks who've worked in government know, these statements don't come out of nowhere. They require a lot of work, and it is a it is a negotiation between not just Japan and the U.S., but among four different organizations. In this case, the Departments of State and Defense and Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense in Japan. But in this case, this was actually a pretty straightforward exercise. It was between friends, Japan and the U.S. This statement came together really quickly. We had a strong meeting of the minds because I think right now our alliance is in a great place. We see eye to eye on so many different issues, whether it is the challenge of China, whether it's the DPRK, whether it's concern about our shared values being eroded, in certain parts of the region and around the world. And so really the message of Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin's trip to Japan and to South Korea was quite simple. It was really to deliver the message that President Biden has stated very clearly that foreign policy, that diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy, and that our alliances are key to any successful foreign policy or national security policy. So really, it was no coincidence that Japan was the first stop of the first trip of any cabinet member, in this case, members of the Biden administration. And so really just a strong emphasis on the importance of our alliances to our foreign policy, and reading the 2+2 statement. And there are a couple of other documents which I'd commend to folks that came out of that stop in Tokyo. One was a readout of the meeting with Foreign Minister Motegi, and another was a fact sheet that laid out some of the key themes of the visit. As we've already heard, of course, the DPRK was one of them. Really, it's important to us as we conduct this North Korea policy review that we are able to hear directly from our allies who have such stakes in the issue, Japan and South Korea. And so really it was important for Secretaries Biden and Austin to hear directly from their counterparts about the threat posed by the North and also potential opportunities going forward. Of course, the challenge of China loomed large in their discussions in Tokyo, and thus is also a major feature of the 2+2 statement. But other things like concerns about what's happening in Burma, and sort of writ more largely what's happening with democracy in the region, and concerns about China, of course, what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, what's happening in Hong Kong, and the autonomy that had been promised Hong Kong that's being eroded slowly but unfortunately surely. What's happening with Taiwan and Taiwan's international space being undermined. And so these are all areas in which we in Japan share very, very key interests. And so the meetings last week were a real just early opportunity to get together and share views and really to show the world how much we are in agreement. Lots of things to work on going forward, things like climate change, cybersecurity, of course, global health, specifically COVID, and working together on vaccines as we promised to do in the Quad Ministerial a couple of weeks ago, working together on things like clean energy, supply chain resilience, all areas that our two countries there's no daylight between us. And so as someone who gets to work every day on the US-Japan alliance, a lot of exciting things to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And just a quick follow-up. There was a sense by some observers in the last administration that the highest levels of the U.S. government didn't show up for all the necessary meetings in the region, some of the key ones, and that as a result, the U.S. felt a little less present. Thrilled to know that this was the first stop, for the senior U.S. Decision makers, and just wanted to get a sense. Is there more to come? Will there be less of a sense, do you think, of that sort of less than optimal presence in this administration? Is there a sort of a commitment to keep this going, starting with this very first important trip?
Well, I hope so. I get in trouble if I pledged the time and of the president and the Secretary of State, but definitely I think this idea that our alliances are critical to our foreign policy, to our national security, I think that will translate into continued future high-level engagement, whether it's here in Washington or anywhere else.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. And it's a good sign that the Prime Minister is also the first major visit to DC. Let me turn now to Dr. Nakayama for his thoughts on those recent developments and his insights from what he observed and what he expects to come next.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. This Pacific shift by the Atlantic Council is always a welcome. It's nice to sort of take part in that shift, and nice to be with Sheila and Mark. Well, I've been constantly complaining for the past 4 years. Right? So I think I can't complain about what's going on. But I guess my role is not to sort of appraise what's going on. So let me be a bit critical. I think many of you know, and many of the audience know, that Japan was a bit skeptical about Biden presidency's sort of Asia focus, or the lack of it. Here in Japan, I think there's a strong sense that we are at the forefront of sort of a long global strategic competition, which could sort of result in a confrontation with China. So this sense of acuteness sort of forced us to believe that Mr. Trump's blunt and rough, but straightforward toughness wasn't all that bad. And when we learned that Mr. Biden, President Biden, would be the Democratic candidate, and if he wins, maybe sort of Democrats would go back to the sort of the earlier part of the Obama presidency, which to us looked like sort of based on this notion. This is about handling China, based on the notion of G2, right? That was the worry. But I would say that so far, I think that worry has totally evaporated. I think with the Quad meeting, the 2+2. And hopefully the visit of Prime Minister Suga to Washington. So I think the Biden team's message has been that it has consistently and unambiguously tough, and most importantly, it seemed to be very sophisticated and nuanced in their approach to China. Not just confronting China, but surrounding China with the sort of the kind of desirable norms and order that we prefer, together with allies and partners. And about the document, that was made public after the 2+2, I think there was several points that I took note. That of course, it was important that China, in terms of its politics, its economy, military, and technology, important that the two countries showed a clear concern. In the previous 2+2, that concern wasn't all that clear. So I think that point was really important. And also the fact that Taiwan was mentioned. It was about stability and peace, but the fact that Taiwan was mentioned in the document was, I think, pretty significant. I don't know what the process of how sort of a sentence about the Taiwan entered, whether it was an American initiative or Japanese initiative, I don't know. But I think the fact that it was mentioned was, I think, pretty significant. And also with regard to North Korea, there's a talk about sort of treating North Korea, DPRK, as a nuclear power. We sort of hear that sometimes, but I think in the document, it was clearly mentioned that denuclearization is the goal. And I think that was pretty good. Lastly, one concern, and this is with regard to comparing the documents between the US ROK 2+2. In the U.S. Japan 2+2 document, it was about China, right? Not totally, but China was clearly one of the main focus. But if you compare the U.S. ROK 2+2 document, China was almost not there. Naturally, because U.S. ROK alliance is about dealing with DPRK, understandable. But the fact that it was almost omitted concerned us a bit. And lastly, on the Alaska sort of meeting, we knew that it was going to be tense, but I think it was much more tense than we expected. But then again, I think the Chinese side was sort of addressing the message to the domestic public. So in that sense, it's not it's understandable. But now I think China knows and the world knows that this tough sort of stance toward China is really bipartisan. And I think that was a strong message, and I think that was good. So I'll end here for now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doctor. Just wanted to go back, ask you one question. I mean, comparing the two statements, was China ever a significant element of the U.S. ROC? 2+2 or any similar statements? And did you expect a major change if it wasn't? What's your thought on that? Because I think that's important.
We understand that US-ROK alliance is about contingency on Korean Peninsula. So, and we know that Korea is not fully on board in terms of how we perceive threats from China and their hegemonic sort of ambitions. But then again, this frame of 2+2 is not solely on alliance, but it's a dialogue between senior leaders from both countries. And the fact that, at least in the public document, that China was almost not mentioned. I think the term China was mentioned once, but not in the context of threat and the worries. So it was nothing new, but we took note of it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and certainly with a lot of dramatic change in the challenges posed by China, we should expect to see more going forward, regardless of the status of, as I said, the growing North Korea nuclear threat, among other challenges. Taking too long to get to Dr. Smith, but it's great, finally. Now we want to hear her thoughts on the same issues. I'm sure we'll be hearing quite a bit more. Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Barry. I'm happy to add to what Mark and Toshi have already said. I think from my vantage point, I will be unabashedly happy about the All Asia Week. And I say that as an Asia watcher, Asia analyst. I agree that there was this very sophisticated and synchronized timing of the events of the week, starting with the leaders meeting at the Quad, then moving to our treaty ally, first and foremost, Japan, and then the ROC, and then Secretary Austin going off to India, which we don't talk about a lot. We focus on the Alaska dynamics with China, but we forget that Secretary of Defense went off to Delhi, and that's a very important piece of the puzzle as well. So I thought it was really well organized, and if you needed a signal of reassurance about the Biden administration's value, geostrategic engagement with and value of our partners in the region, you couldn't have asked for a better one. So I wanted to commend the administration on that. I also want to commend our Japanese counterparts as well, because a lot of the worry, I think, going into the new administration was, as Toshi pointed out, would the Biden administration be tough on China? Would they come at the region with the same focus on the free and open Indo-Pacific? And so what you saw early on was Japan's role, a quiet role, but a very important one in communicating here in Washington, the framework that the alliance will best operate in. And I think, again, we shouldn't underestimate the role that Japan has played in framing the new administration's approach. So kudos to both governments for a really nice setup. I won't go into the details of the statement because the previous speakers have, but we were all very pleased to see a direct statement of mutual concern about the behavior of China in the region. And I think it was very explicit and it needed to be said. I think all of us have been watching the region over the last year or so and watching in particular some of the behaviors, not just in the human rights domain, but also in the maritime domain around and through the South China Sea and East China Sea. So there's real reasons here to sink our teeth into a serious conversation with China. And I think for the first time, you see Tokyo and Washington really on the same page about what that agenda could look like. I also think it's really interesting that, us Japan, U.S.-Japan watchers are expected the Article 5 reassurance statement, and that has now become a norm in any kind of high-level meeting. And so again, President Biden ticked that box before this week started, but it was very explicitly asserted, and it was reasserted in conjunction with a comment on Taiwan. And I think it's important. All of our listeners probably can imagine that region, the geography of that region. Absolutely crucial that we understand that the activities of the PLA in and around the East China Sea have serious consequences, not only for Japan, but for others as well. So I think we're in good shape. I'm not going to get into the challenges ahead because I think we're going to talk about that a little bit. Let me just say what I thought it demonstrated in terms of the Biden administration's particular approach. And again, I want to reiterate what both Mark and Toshi have said: is you've got a very sophisticated team who have been here before, in the sense that they have had experience in the Obama administration, but the region has changed. They have evaluated the change in Chinese behavior. And I think what was very reassuring, I think, for the region, but also for people like me, is to see just how clearly the signals were being sent that this is not a G2 moment. This is not a China first moment in terms of our strategic approach. This is an allied coalition approach where we're coming together with like-minded partners and we're developing an agenda with them. Not just we're having meetings, but we are developing a constructive and integrated agenda where the leverage for the region and for our interactions with China will be shared. And I think this will be the hard work going forward to be consistent and persistent with this approach. But it's a very different approach from the previous administration, obviously, but also from the two Obama terms as well. So I think I'm just going to close with one last piece, which I think is really important about the region and the assets that both Japan and the United States can bring to bear in building these networks of collaboration. They're not all military. They're not all hard power, as Mark pointed out. Our innovative capacity, our ability to think about resilience in a broad and comprehensive way, be it COVID, vaccine development, economic recovery from the pandemic, resilience in terms of responding to any kind of coercion against one of the partners, and I'm thinking here specifically of the trade pressure on Australia. There's a series of, there's a mindset here that this is going to be going forward difficult. It's not going to be easy. And we are going to have to think not just about our own national vulnerabilities, but also our collective vulnerabilities. And I think that's a really wise approach. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Really, really good points. I love the point on shared leverage and on building out an agenda, and that it is, military is necessary, but it's really a broader question. And the chair of the Scowcroft Center, General Jim Jones, has said, on this, for this competition, it's going to be largely won on in other domains, in particular technology, the economy, and others. So thank you. Let me just ask each of you about what happened in Alaska. We knew the Biden administration would be tough. We knew the consensus in Washington had changed, as you pointed out, as all of you pointed out. But we didn't expect this kind of open, really significant public friction. And I just, more than the theatrics and the drama, it's a question, how might this affect the role that the alliance can play going forward? In other words, are we seeing the beginning of a real spiral down in the U.S.-China relationship, or do you think that was, it was just the first meeting and things will settle out? And I ask this not only for the U.S.-China, but for the purposes of this discussion, U.S.-Japan alliance. It's going to have to really lead in the management of the trajectory of the competition. So would love your thoughts on that, Dr. Smith.
Oh, thank you, Barry. So I'll just be brief. I think we should expect more of this going forward. And there's two things that sort of struck me about Alaska, and that is, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, both of our governments know them very, very well. They're very sophisticated managers of China's national security and foreign policy. And, but but it seemed to me that there's also a pent-up Chinese frustration because they have been out not having conversations with the United States in a normal manner for a long time. So that sort of I got that sense. The other is in the public domain. We've seen Chinese diplomats and foreign ministry spokespersons and others take on a much more pugilistic tone, let's just say, a rhetorical tone that's not what we used to hearing from diplomatic sources. I think that's going to be with us. I don't think we should expect that. But behind the rhetoric, I think, is the question, and that's the real behind the scenes. What happened? Do we really have evidence that there's going to be some places where we can engage? And I mean that for Tokyo as well as for Washington and Canberra and New Delhi, for that matter. I'm watching the climate change meetings to see whether or not, right, our new envoy, former Secretary Kerry, will be able to make much progress there. But I think we should expect now, given the Quad focus, that there will be an awful lot of pressure put on individual members of the Quad to weaken it, either in the eyes of an international audience or just to push on some of the areas where we're not always at ease with some of the ways in which each other goes forward. And so I think for Tokyo, it's true. The Global Times already has a piece, challenging Japan's subservience to America. And, so the rhetoric is still going to be with us. And I think that's going to be something we'll just have to live with.
Thank you very much. And, I do worry, once you sort of stir up the sort of the nationalist, feelings and fervor, even in a country that's not a democracy, it's a dictatorship, China, that might be something that's kind of hard to turn off. So I worry a little bit about that. Dr. Nakayama, what's your thoughts on how the Alaska meeting might affect the challenges that the alliance has to manage related to China?
Well, I've touched upon a bit in my sort of opening remarks. I think there was an element of theatrics, as Sheila mentioned, but I also think it was a clear message that China has hegemonic ambitions, and I think that sort of line of thinking has been strengthened as a result of how U.S. managed the corona crisis. And that sense was already there as a result of the economic recession in 2008-9 period. But I think now they're pretty determined and convinced that their ambitions are global. We don't know sort of the time span in which they're aspiring to sort of overcome the United States. But I think we saw a public a statement of this ambition, and in a way, I welcome the Quad framework, right? For maritime democracies getting together, not to contain China, but to surround China with a desirable set of norms and rules so that we can try to complicate China's sort of rise and ambitions. And that's, I think, it's a bit different from sort of containing, Soviet Union, right? It's about sort of establishing a strong, desired rule-based order, if necessary with force, right? So I think it was good. But in a way, it was a statement from our side that we can't handle China alone, right? So in a sense, I think they saw a weakness in that. Yes, I think they're nervous as well, but at the same time, you could be sort of confident and nervous at the same time, right? So I think the Quad had that kind of effect, and the sort of the statement in Anchorage and the performance in Anchorage sort of highlighted that.
Thank you very much. That's very thoughtful. Let me turn to Mark Napper now and look ahead a little bit. We have the likelihood, it seems, of a Prime Minister Suga visit to the White House next month. What might be the priority items for that discussion between Suga and Biden? What should we make of the fact that this is likely the first in-person visit by a foreign leader to the Biden White House. There was a lot of good agenda items in the 2+2 statement. So where do you see the alliance fitting into the kinds of issues we just discussed, Mark? What do you think is the priority for the White House discussion if it happens next month?
Well, thanks, Barry. And I mean, there actually hasn't been a formal announcement just yet of the visit, so have to be a little bit careful. But assuming that one does happen, I think it's going to be a great follow-up to the recent meetings in Tokyo. I think we're eager to, it's always amazing to me for a relationship that's as mature and sort of well worked over as the U.S.-Japan relationship is. We're always finding new areas of cooperation, always finding ways to deepen an already very, very fruitful and beneficial relationship. And so I think some of the things we would certainly look forward to growing our relationship would be in just take a look at the Quad, the results of the Quad summit, and I think you'll see some areas that the U.S. and Japan can deepen our ties. Climate change, of course, is going to be huge. I think the global pandemic, not just sort of dealing, getting more vaccines out into the world and into the developing world in particular, but working with Japan and other like-minded countries on, for example, strengthening our surveillance capabilities to better be able to recognize when there is an outbreak somewhere, and then doing a better job of containing it and preventing it from spreading the way COVID-19 did. I think if you just look at some of the Biden administration's economic priorities, supply chain resilience is an area in which the U.S. and Japan can work very closely, and upon the basis of our bilateral cooperation, hopefully grow that to include other partners around the world, whether it's Australia or the EU or Canada, South Korea. And so that will be another key area. Clean energy, of course, related to climate change, but the US and Japan already have such a strong relationship in the energy space through our Japan-US strategic energy partnership, and trying to find ways perhaps to build upon this partnership to include clean energy cooperation. So I think really we can look forward through potential high-level visits, possible high-level visits, to find ways to grow even more our bilateral ties and hopefully use those ties for the betterment, not just of the region, but of the entire world.
Thank you. Just thinking again about a possible summit meeting, and if it's let's just say a month away, it seems like there's such dynamism in what's going on in our priorities, and there's not a day where I don't wake up and see something new. And a question I have for Dr. Nakayama and Dr. Smith is, how agile do you think Xi Jinping is going to be in the aftermath of Alaska? Will he, I agree with the point, he's going to try to drive wedges among the members of the Quad with various narratives, but I also imagine if he's pretty nimble, there'll be a lot more carrots and maybe a few less sticks that he's applying all over the world. He can't be happy with how he's alienating the EU in the aftermath of the CAI. We're just seeing almost a daily defection from Chinese priorities. We saw the Lithuanians drop from what was the 17+1, I think, over the last 24 hours. Do you think sort of as, that the agenda between the prime minister and the president, might be so fluid that between now and then, do you see Xi Jinping sort of throwing a few more carrots out there and a few less sticks? Dr. Nakayama, Dr. Smith?
Yes, although I'm not a sort of a China expert, there's sort of a line of thinking here in Japan that this toughness by the two senior diplomats in Alaska was to set a stage for more sort of, a stable sort of and quiet meeting between President Biden and President Xi. We don't know how that's going to turn out. But if you look at what China is doing right now, I mean, they're confronting everybody, right? Everybody around. So that's why I sort of made a conclusion, and many of us in Japan has made a conclusion that China is pretty determined that their rise is is their destiny, right? And I think we're precisely at that moment in history. We're seeing a determined China trying to test the resolve of the U.S. and its allies. And like I said at the outset, I welcome Biden administration's sophisticated, well-coordinated China policy. But then again, the worry that I have is that the more sophisticated the policy becomes, it's a very multidimensional sort of policy, right? The execution would be pretty difficult, right? And the messaging part was really difficult as well. Sort of, we might recall the Obama sort of rebalance strategy, right? That was also a very well coordinated, sophisticated Asia policy. But from the sort of the receiving side, or the message receiving side, the message wasn't always that clear. It was a whole bunch of things that U.S. had to do, and we didn't see sort of the priorities, right? What is the core issue that U.S. sees in the region? Maybe everything is important, but at the same time, I think U.S. has to send a clear message that this is our priority, and that part was missing, at least from the receiving side, in the rebalance. So the worry that we have about the sort of the Biden team's Asia policy is this: yes, I support the sophisticatedness of the policy, but the execution, we're a bit worried. So I think, again, I think we're being tested by China, and China has shown its determination, and we're being tested. And I think we have to sort of send a message to China that we're not going to confront all the time, but we're going to challenge your ambitions, and we're going to make your challenge more complicated, and try to push back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Smith, your thoughts?
Sure, Barry, thank you. So let me speak a little bit to what Toshi was saying, but let me also share that what's going to happen if Prime Minister Suga comes next month will be a reaffirmation of the strength of the partnership. Will include a little drilling down on some of the issues that Mark and his colleagues in Tokyo developed for the 2+2. We are at a moment, and this is important for your audience to understand, is we're coming out in the Biden administration with a North Korea policy review. So before Prime Minister Suga arrives, we are going to have next week a National Security Advisors meeting, a trilateral meeting between our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, the South Korean National Security Advisor, Mr. Seoul, and Mr. Kitamura, the National Security Advisor in Tokyo. So next week, we'll see a little bit more about what our government's, I don't have access to it, but our government's policy review has yielded. And of course, we've all been reading in the newspapers about North Korea doing smaller testing and things like that. But I think there is going to be an attempt on the trilateral side, US, Japan, South Korea, to dig down a little bit deeper on how to align ourselves, right? In this moment. The second piece is on the China piece. I have been watching, and again, we're all Washington watchers, so we have our own little speculative moment here. But my understanding is that the Biden administration is taking its time on the China piece. First, to sort of gauge where and how Beijing wants to, how it's going to approach the problem with the United States, but also to consult very heavily with our partners. And so I think what we're watching here is a kind of development of an approach. I may think, and this is for Toshi, I don't know if we're ever going to see a China strategy. I think what you're going to see in a year or so is a Biden administration's national strategy, much like Japan has its national security strategy. And it may not have China in the title, but it will be all about how to deal with the strategic competition with China and Russia. So I expect that the China piece will be woven throughout our strategic thought process. And I anticipate the Biden administration will take its time. And that's my I could be wrong on that, but that's, I think, the process level. There's some perennial issues, though, Barry, that we always have to pay attention to in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And we always have to touch base, and we make sure we're doing everything we can to ensure A, deterrence, B, the defense of Japan, and also that we align ourselves on the diplomatic agenda going forward. So I've already spoken about the North Korean diplomatic agenda, but it's useful to remember that in February, the Chinese sent vessels to the Senkaku Islands just about every day. So there's an upping of the pressure, or at least the demonstration of Chinese capabilities. There's another piece of the puzzle, which is the new Coast Guard law that the Chinese have announced, which is going to allow their Coast Guard to actually, they said they have permission to shoot. And so what does that mean around the Senkaku Islands? And I think the Coast Guards of Japan and China have been very careful to stay away and not have a miscalculation or mistake in that region. But you do see an upping the ante here in terms of the potential for use of force that wasn't there in the past. So I think there's a lot to talk about, even in the same framing, beyond just Article 5 reassurance. I think we got to get to the heart of the matter about how the alliance is going to work given these changes. And of course, back to Taiwan, that's a piece of the puzzle that is big. And you may or may not have seen our new nominee for the Indochina Command, Admiral Aquilino, was testifying on the Hill. He and his predecessor, Admiral Davidson, have put Taiwan front and center. And so I think our friends in Tokyo are watching that conversation very carefully. And I assume that there will be a continued touching base between the Prime Minister and the President, should the Prime Minister come. The last piece is always our economic policy. And, we're coming out of a 4-year administration where tariffs became an instrument of American trade policy in a way that they hadn't for decades. And this was not just vis-a-vis China, but it was also vis-a-vis our allies. So we have a bilateral trade agreement that was negotiated between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. But I do think there's a little bit of a residual piece of homework here to think through our economic partnership as we move forward. I don't expect the United States to jump into TPP or CPTPP, the Regional Trade Agreement as it's currently referred to, but I think there is going to have to be a conversation, a quiet conversation between Washington and Tokyo about how we expand our coordination and collaboration on the trade side as well.
Really important points, Dr. Smith. You raised just a number of them. With an eye on the remaining 7 minutes of this session, we did get a question from the audience that's relevant to the trilateral cooperation issues that were just raised. So I might turn to Mr. Napper for that. The question is from Tom Gill from the Secretary of the Air Force's International Affairs Office. And he asks about thoughts on facilitation of a closer trilateral relationship in the wake of the two great bilateral 2+2 engagements of the last month. Mark, where do you see that headed? Is there more possibility than there was during the last administration in light of all these changing circumstances?
Absolutely, and I think it's a great question. With Secretary Blinken, we have someone who has got just deep experience in participating in trilateral cooperative efforts with both Japan and Korea. When he was our deputy secretary in the second term of the Obama administration, he, on a quarterly basis, participated in trilateral meetings with his Japanese and Korean counterparts, Im Sung-nam from South Korea and Vice Minister Sugiyama from Japan. And of course, these discussions very much do end up having North Korea as kind of the least common denominator that all three of us can sit down and discuss. But the effort was made, and I think successfully, to find other areas of shared interest, shared cooperation, shared challenges. And so really, I mean, the discussions every quarter ranged from regional issues like North Korea, but Southeast Asia, development assistance, counter-piracy in the Indian Ocean, efforts we were undertaking to help electrify lesser developed countries in Africa, promoting women's empowerment, looking at Afghanistan, Middle East peace process, and on and on. And so every one of these issues, the US, Japan, and South Korea, we all are playing a role. And I think we just need to figure out how can we ensure that our efforts are complementary and not redundant or duplicative. But most of all, it's just, we need to recognize, and I think we do, that we're much stronger together than apart. And the sum of our efforts is much greater than, or the whole of our efforts is much greater than just a simple sum. And so I think we're going to see that going forward. I think Secretary Blinken is a sincere advocate on behalf of trilateral cooperation. And certainly I think our partners in Japan and Korea are willing as well to sit down and find ways the three of us can go forward together.
Thanks, Mark. Toshihiro, what do you think about the prospects for trilateral cooperation in these circumstances? Please unmute. Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
Sorry,
Great.
I have to do this at least once during these webinars. Well, as Mark said, we're stronger together, and there's a strong sort of understanding here in Japan as well that Japan ROK US cooperation is good for the region and good for all of us. But then again, in order to actually sort of proceed forward, we have to sort of separate the contentious issues and the issues that we can cooperate. And that's so difficult to do on both sides, right? And also, I mentioned this at the outset as well, there are various issues that we all can tackle, but the core issue that we're facing in terms of foreign policy and national security policy, it is China, right? And on that, we're not totally on the same. Even US and Japan, there are differences. But the perception of China in ROK, I see a sign that we may be on a very different boat. So that is always a worry for us. And our expectation is we're not asking Korea to join Quad Plus. They're not willing to do that. But at least if we can share sort of the same outlook of the region, I think that will be a good start. But we're not even at that point yet. So hopefully this trilateral sort of a meeting with the three national security advisors, we can sort of coordinate and share sort of the general outlook of the region.
Thank you very much. With just 2 minutes left, I'm going to do what I call a lightning round question. To me, Taiwan is just such a major issue, and a lot of colleagues that I respect say that it's kind of flashing red. The chances for a miscalculation or some sort of crisis seems pretty high over the next 12 months or so, unfortunately. What's your sense of the alliance's role? Do you think more needs to be done? Would we, looking back at a crisis, would we wish we would have done more, both either publicly or privately or both, to both deter and prepare for such a crisis? What do you think about that, Dr. Smith?
So in the past, Japan has had a different diplomatic framing of the issue, cares about peaceful relations across the straits, doesn't have a hard power or military role in the same way that the United States does. I think what we're looking at now is a conversation that is coming to the top about, well, what if, the worst case scenario, what if? But I think the real question, and this is where Tokyo and Washington can do an awful lot, I think, is to think about how do we prevent any kind of perception that there's an opportunity here. And we all know that the Taiwan issue is what the Chinese call it core interest. This is a very important and delicate and sensitive issue for Beijing. So the balancing act between not poking China on Taiwan, but understanding and making it clear that the independence of Taiwan is something that not just Japan and the United States feel strongly about, but that other countries, our European partners, right? Other partners around the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific also. So there's some really important, I think, diplomatic work to be done as well. And I think Japan is going to have to take a little bit more of a forthright role in that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Nakayama, any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with Sheila. I think the alliance is not well prepared for at least the contingency in the Straits. So at least it's a good start that Japan has sort of agreed to start talking about it, but at the moment we're not prepared, and we don't have that much of a time And Japan is not known for quickness. So I think we have to focus on the speed.
Mark, you get the last word.
Yeah, so I would say that I think one reason to be optimistic, at least about U.S.-Japan coordination in this area, is, and just getting back to how the 2+2 statement sort of came to life. Really, the contents, it was just so organic in the way that we approach things, and it seemed just like a natural thing for us to include in our statement. One side didn't have to coax the other to include language, in this case on Taiwan, and so I think that really does reflect a certain consonance of views, and so we got a ways to go. We have work to do, but really, and it's for the first time in a while, or maybe ever, we do really see the need to work very closely on this.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. Just fantastic, interesting, important, insightful conversation. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts, and we'll certainly be coming back to all of you as these developments continue. For now, we're going to have a brief break, but for those of you rejoining for the next session at 7:15 Eastern Time, please see the link that was posted in the chat. And when at that point, we will be having a panel on multilateral cooperation and the Quad with a simply fantastic lineup of panelists moderated by Dr. O. So thank you all very much for joining us for this first session, and we'll see you again in about 13 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this second panel session on multilateral cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and the role of the Quad. I'm Miyano, Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Security Initiative in the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's session with a fantastic panel of experts who will bring perspective from all four Quad member countries. We're witnessing a major strategic moment for the Quad. The first Quad summit produced a joint statement from the four member countries that affirmed a united shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific and vowed to strengthening cooperation on the defining challenge of our time. In addition to outlining the broad contours of a shared vision for the Quad, it announced 3 concrete actions to begin operationalizing cooperation in the form of working groups on vaccines, climate, and critical and emerging technologies. The months ahead will be critical as we closely monitor progress on these efforts to evaluate their success and identify the new avenues of potential cooperation based on these initial efforts. While the Quad has taken a major first step this month, major questions still exist about the strategic role of the Quad in the region and its future efforts. What are the greatest priorities of each member of the Quad, and where do we see their interests converging and diverging? How will the Quad define a proactive regional agenda that avoids being framed simplistically as an anti-China alliance? Or are some of the member countries, such as the United States, envisioning the Quad as informal multilateral framework that manages and respond to the rise of China? To what extent will the Quad, which started as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, pursue direct security cooperation moving forward? What other allies and partners might agree to participate in Quad-led effort under the Quad Plus framework? And how will the Quad sync with other multilateral efforts and stakeholders in the region, including ASEAN? In the Asia Security Initiative that I'm running, we recognize that there is sometimes too often a gap in mutual understanding between Washington and its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And we see that direct engagement with regional stakeholders is essential to helping bridge the gap. And when it comes to the Quad, I see one of the biggest gaps surrounding security given the current geopolitical landscape with enduring US-China tensions. In Washington, we have heard lots of analysis that frames the Quad as an institution focused on security cooperation. But the first summit and the joint statement suggest that the 4 member countries think of its scope and purpose much more broadly. To that end, I hope that today's discussion will illuminate many of these key questions and help our audiences better understand what to expect from the Quad in the days ahead. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep their intros very brief so that we can get right into the discussion. First, we have Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director of the new Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. Lisa is recently out of government, where she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021. Next, we have Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki is a Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center. Next, we have Jagannath Panda, Research Fellow and Coordinator of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, East Asia Center. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ashley Townsend, Director of Foreign Policy and Defense at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. So to kick off our discussion, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to offer brief opening remarks on their assessment of the first Quad Summit and what it means for their specific country focus moving forward. And let's start with Lisa. And Lisa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mian. It's great to be here. And Yeah, let me just start by noting that the Quad, the idea of the Quad, these four countries meeting together, goes all the way back to 2007. And it was really former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe who came up with the idea of the Quad. It really didn't take off until 2017 during the previous administration. And I think events over the last year, COVID-19, some of the aggressive behavior we saw from China over the last year really motivated all of the countries of the Quad to take it more seriously and to elevate its activities. And I think it's quite remarkable that the Biden administration was able to hold the first ever leaders level Quad within 60 days of taking power. That was quite a feat. And not only that, but they also issued the first ever joint statement of the Quad. And some of the highlights of the joint statement and the fact sheet are number one, the initiative to produce more and distribute vaccines throughout Southeast Asia. That is, Japan and the United States providing financing to increase the production of vaccine within India, and Australia helping with the distribution of that vaccine. So this was quite a remarkable initiative. It shows that the Quad can pool its resources and capabilities to do positive things for the region. As you mentioned, there's been some questions. Is this a China containment strategy? Will this be a new Asian NATO? But I think what we've seen from the Biden administration is an emphasis on the positive activities that the Quad can do for the region. And of course, two other working groups were established, the climate change working group, as well as the technology, critical and emerging technologies. And I think this working group is particularly important because what we're looking at is a world where we need to think about how to protect critical technologies and technology infrastructure. This will encompass everything from 5G technologies to undersea fiber optic cables, supply chains, creating resilient supply chains, and protecting critical minerals. And it's important for the Quad countries to work together to ensure that any emerging and digital technologies will bolster democratic development rather than encourage authoritarian trends in the region. And the second thing is to protect this technology and infrastructure to make sure it's trusted and to protect it from malign activities. So I think these are a few of the very important initiatives that I think we have seen the Quad take, and it's really quite exciting to see the Biden administration not only building on what the previous administration had done with the Quad, but really putting the Quad at the center of its Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And now I'd like to turn to Yuki.
Yes, thank you, Mia, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for having me for this very important discussion. And I very much agree with what Lisa just said on the outset, that it is quite remarkable that the Biden administration was able to put together this virtual first ever leaders summit within a very short amount of time since its inauguration. And not only that, there's a Quad meeting really followed by Secretary of State Blinken and the Secretary of State Austin's joint visit to Japan and South Korea, where both of the cabinet ministers had their security consultative committee. And from that point, Secretary Blinken, as we all know, came back to the United States and had a very tough, firm conversation with his Chinese counterpart, whereas Secretary Austin moved to India to further the regional security dialogue. So all these series of events really is quite assuring and encouraging for Japan. As Lisa pointed out, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe first came up with this security diamond concept back in 2006, 2007, when he was the first Prime Minister. But then also the nascent shape of a Quad cooperation can be actually traced back to 2004, where U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, each of the countries' navy really formed the core group in the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the aftermath of a tsunami and earthquake in the Indo-Pacific region. So from that point on, I think Quad has maintained a very consistent nature, which is very agile, mobile, and adaptive to the evolving security environment and what security environment requires all these countries to do. And looking at the this is definitely a free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which is symbolized by Quad cooperation, is absolutely the top foreign policy priority for Japanese current Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. And I think in his mind, my view is that Quad cooperation is not necessarily mutually exclusive with the other regional arrangements, such as ASEAN, ARF, East Asia Forum. Rather, I believe when Prime Minister Suga had the first conversation with President Biden on this issue, they both agreed that the ASEAN centrality needs to be supported in this endeavor. So I really see this Quad framework as a more of a force multiplier, where Quad serves as a more of a foundation out of which U.S., Japan, Australia, and India reach out to other countries that shares the concerns and shares the interest to advance the discuss and potentially explore the additional areas of cooperation. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Yuki. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Panda. And, as someone who has been writing a lot on the Quad and from India's perspective, and also your deep expertise on China, so what do you see make out of the summit?
Dr. Miono, good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. My first impression about the Quad Leadership Summit is that it's a big statement. It's a big political statement in the regions. And I think what we are seeing is that this is a strong step towards the institutionalization process of the Quad. I think as Dr. Lisa Cortes pointed out, that the grouping is there for last 1 decade or so, and only in 2017 we tried to revitalize it. But with the leadership summit, I think we have made a strong political statement in the regions that differences in foreign policy approaches does not necessarily mean that there is a division in their regional vision. And I think this leadership summit was more about that, trying to come together and trying to have a broad, comprehensive political vision towards the regions. And if we see the joint statement which has been released, it is a first ever joint statement by the Quad members. And this is a comprehensive joint statement. And it is a detailed joint statement. As one could see, there is a lot of new things has emerged. For example, earlier, we used to only talk about free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And in this joint statement, there is a statement that the region is not only going to be, or the way the Quad countries are looking at as only free and open Indo-Pacific, but it should be inclusive. And more importantly, it should be a resilient, democratic Indo-Pacific. And I think that's the emphasis is all about. And I think with this leadership summit, there is a direction has been offered to the Quad Leadership Summit and to the Quad process. And probably we'll see that the process is getting gradually institutionalized. The other thing is that I think the Leadership Summit offers a kind of gateway for the progress of the Quad and probably start operationalizing the process. And I think when we are using the term resilience Indo-Pacific, that means there is an emphasis to operationalize it, to try to bring it more, issue-oriented, specific, target-oriented objectives to the grouping. And to that effect, what we will see that Quad process started moving to the next stage, having more, political, economic, and socio-economic issues in the regions. So far, there has been a widespread misconception about the Quad process that it is primarily a security-oriented process. Yes, it is a very much security-oriented process, and the way the talks have been happening all this while among the Quad countries, there are enormous security issues, and the way we are dealing with the revisionist China in the regions, particularly in the China-India border, in the Senkaku Island regions, and in the South China Sea to Taiwan Strait, there are security angle attached to it. But more than that, what this leadership summit does is that I think it gives an impression that there are other issues needs to be discussed in the Indo-Pacific regions. And therefore, they talked about growth and development. They talk about capacity building. They talked about soft security networks in the regions. And I think that's the hallmarks of this leadership summit. So therefore, I do see this leadership summit as a step towards institutionalization of the Quad process. And more importantly, it is the starting point of getting operationalized from now on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now, Ashley Townsend, how do you evaluate the summit from Australia's perspective?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks also to the Atlantic Council for hosting this great event. Look, I'm going to agree with everything that's gone before me and just pick up on some additional points from an Australian perspective. Clearly, it is a big sign, clearly elevating the Quad meeting to the leadership level and potentially annualizing that into the future is an incredibly positive investment by all four countries into this entity. I'm not sure it's an institution yet, but into this entity as a contributor to regional order in the Indo-Pacific. Clearly the message is the right one. And I think here we've seen some of the language that the Trump administration used, some of the administration that the Japanese have used over the years, some that India and Australia have used, all meshed together to create something that's a little bit new, that emphasizes resilience, inclusivity, as well as freedomness, openness, stability, etc. And so they are good. That's a good sign of the way the countries are finding their feet and bringing together different priorities and different audiences that they're trying to speak to with their respective regional strategies. But overall, I think what it does is it places an emphasis on regional order building and resilience ahead of what people had, skeptics had criticized the Quad for, unjustifiably in my view, previously, which is to say that it puts confrontation with China and balancing of everything else. It's about balancing, but it's about a lot more than that. It always has been. And this statement, in particular the op-ed, I think, in the Washington Post, which will be read by many more people, let's face it, than the statement itself, really brings that point home. And really one of the important things about all of this is that it's picked up again on what, certainly from an Australian perspective, has been a major priority of our foreign and defence policy over the last few years, which is to place a focus on the region's needs ahead of everything else. And so the working groups that have been set up on vaccines, the vaccine provision in the region, on critical technology and on climate, are all examples of things, particularly the first and last of those, which matter so much to countries in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and indeed right across the region. These are the things that they look to countries with means, countries like the three big powers, US, Japan, and Australia, and India, and Australia, the capable middle power, to provide for the region, to invest in the region, to fill that gap in terms of the provision of non-traditional security assistance that is frankly far more important to most people. So from an investment in the region perspective, as well as from a sort of strategic public relations perspective, it's been an incredibly important set of initiatives. I think it signals a few things that maybe haven't been mentioned yet. Firstly, I would argue that this is not a US initiative. Certainly, I hope it wasn't, and it's certainly I hope it's not going to be the heart of US Indo-Pacific strategy for a couple of reasons. First is that the Quad, and every country, every member of it has at different times over its existence, dating back to 2004, been critical to its progression to the next stage. This is not an American agenda, but if it's viewed as one, it will not be as successful as if it's viewed as something that is genuinely quadrilateral in terms of its inception, its continuation, and its progression over the years. And I, in fact, think that that's the case, and that really you're seeing leadership by all 4 countries here, not just US leadership, and that's important. I think, and I'll go out on a limb a little bit here and say also that we might look back on this moment as one of a number of clear signs of the region really becoming multipolar. What we're seeing here is a genuinely combined investment that is not wholly reliant on American power or American economic might, but is in fact just as reliant on the respective capabilities that all 4 Quad members bring together. And this will become the norm into the future. We are moving into a multipolar Indo-Pacific. We're in a multipolar Indo-Pacific. This is something which Australian strategists and Australian foreign and defence policy documents have recognised for some time. And I think this is a substantial demonstration of that. I'll finish with just one concern at this point, because I know we'll dig into the operationalization of it in time. But I do think that there is a degree of risk. It's currently well managed, but a degree of risk when it comes to the democratic focus of the Quad. This is clearly something which is a priority for all 4 countries. It's clearly something which we all have a deep stake in. But I think that emphasis on democracy needs to always be carefully managed when it comes to the pragmatic application of the Quad in terms of investing in regional goods. It is not the case that the Quad has gone down a path that is too ideological in focus at the moment. That's not what I'm saying. But when you do have this associated with, in particular, an agenda of bringing together a summit of democracies and really focusing on regime type as a key criteria for regional strategy, you do start to raise concerns that Australians have had in particular with regards to strategy in the region when it comes to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It's just true that there are many countries, there are many different regime types that will and have to be close partners of the Quad going forward on a range of security and unsecurity issues. So I think this is being managed at the moment, but I do think it's more important to focus on principles that lie beneath democracy, that is to say, transparency, the rule of law, good governance, accountability in big statements, rather than the political ideology of democracy itself. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and everyone for sharing your own assessment. I see that we have a lot to follow up, but I'd like to come back to you, Ashley, and then ask that question on democracy, and because I really like to hear from other panelists. And Lisa, during your opening remarks, you talk about Myanmar and also the Anchorage meeting. So I'd like to ask, because as all of you said, the Quad is a group of 4 major Indo-Pacific democracies. And President Biden has called for the Summit for Democracy during his campaign. So does that make a bit natural fit for democracy promotion in the region? And is the Quad the kind of multilateral framework that could be mobilizing democracies to respond to current trends as Lisa mentioned, of this destabilizing behavior that is inconsistent with international rules and values and norms, such as the coup in Myanmar. So how would you react to what we just heard from Ashley? And maybe I can start with Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually think that promoting democracy and seeking to ensure that democratic trends are fostered and can continue in the region is very important for the Quad. I mean, let's face it, that is one of the driving forces that brings these 4 countries together, that they do value democracy as a form of governance. And I think the idea is ensuring that countries can maintain their sovereignty and independence in the face of attempts by China to coerce them, whether it be economically, militarily, politically. So I do think that is an animating force of the Quad, is the idea that you are helping to insulate countries from falling prey to Chinese coercion. And if we look at the digital space, for example, we see that China is using its domination of digital development in the region to export its authoritarian ideologies through surveillance technology and other means. So again, I think it's very important that these four countries sort of lead the way in promoting technology cooperation so that the trends move in the direction of, you know, techno-democratic development, that these emerging technologies foster democracy and openness, inclusiveness, transparency. It also gets to the Belt and Road Initiative and, you know, China's efforts to provide lending to these countries. Oftentimes it's not transparent, and it's not apparent to the recipient exactly what they're getting themselves into. And we've seen a lot of countries become over indebted to China recently. So again, these four countries can promote transparent infrastructure development. They can pool their resources so that they provide alternatives to countries. Because, you know, the bottom line is this is about ensuring that other countries can maintain their sovereignty and independence. And I would point to the joint statement, which I think has a very important line, and it talks about how the four countries support a region anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. You know, China's not mentioned, but I think we all know what that very important sentence of the joint statement means. So I would say yes, there's going to be differences. It's not always going to be easy, and we can point to Burma as an example. Even though the joint statement mentions Burma and the four countries talked about the importance of restoring democracy to Burma, I would say that probably not all four countries are in line with the idea of sanctioning. The US is more out in front on the issue of sanctioning individuals in Burma. And a country like Japan has a lot of economic interests to consider in their Burma policy. So I'm not saying that the four countries are going to agree on how to treat each country and where it is with its democratic development. But I am saying that democracy is a driving force behind the four countries. And I think it's important. It's important that both country or all countries value democracy, and that is what is bringing them together. Is this real threat to the future of the region, and the idea that these four countries want to work together to make sure that a free, open, independent, and rules-based order prevails in the region.
Thank you. And Yuki, would you like to comment on democracy?
Yes, so this is an important area that the Japanese policy has been evolving since the time of tenure of the Prime Minister Abe. If you recall, right after the Quad meeting, as I mentioned earlier, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin headed to Tokyo and Seoul, and the joint statement that was issued after the Security Consultative Committee between U.S. and Japan on March 16th. Number of interesting statement came out in the joint statement, but then one of the things that struck me was that in there, probably for the first time, the human rights concern in the Xinjiang and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Myanmar was explicitly mentioned as the joint expression of concern from the two government. And Japanese government traditionally has been somewhat hesitant to get on the record on these issues because, as Lisa mentioned, for some of these countries like Myanmar, Japan has its own on a complicated relationship driven by it, both by its economic investment interests, but then also with the desire to not to shut the door of communication by completely turning on, by appearing to be completely turning on its back on the ruling body of the country. But that there is a growing voices within Japan that really, in order for Japan to truly walk the talk about their own vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan also needs to be more forward-leaning when it comes to a human rights issue, and be more, quite frankly, more vocal about it. So this is an interesting area that it continues to evolve, and then I think something grouping like a Quad will be a great venue for Japan to be able to coordinate its approaches and kind of a complement each other's approaches when for complicated issues like this.
Thank you. Dr. Panda?
Yeah, I think from India's point of view, there are three things has to be understood. And I think this goes well with the kind of perspective India is trying to develop vis-a-vis Quad. One is that if we try to recollect India's position, particularly against China's Belt and Road initiatives, it has been quite steadfast. It has been quite straight and direct. And India is the only country in the regions which has taken a specific position from the beginning and has called for transparency, has called for universalism. So I think connectivity is going to be one of the key issues when we are talking about building a democratic resilience Quad process. And I think there, the kind of position India has taken from the beginning against China's Belt and Road initiatives, that needs to be promoted within the grouping. That countries, no matter how strong they are economically or not, they need to stand firmly against any kind of unilateral initiatives that any dominant countries in the regions, authoritarian regions in the regions are trying to promote. And I think that needs to be opposed. To that extent, India would like to see that the connectivity finance patterns, the infrastructure developmental programs, and connectivity promotions has to be on a transparent mode and through a democratic means. And I think that needs to be nurtured as far as India is concerned within the Quad process. The second thing is, I think if we try to understand India's viewpoint towards the Indo-Pacific, and there is a statement India has categorically been making, and from the beginning we have been calling Indo-Pacific as an inclusive construct, as an inclusive concept. So that means we do see that there are a range of countries in the regions. They are not necessarily entirely democratic. There are countries, those who are semi-democratic or semi-authoritarian. And I think we need to encourage those countries to believe in transparent mode, to believe in democratic mode of building cooperative frameworks, and believes in universalisms, which are for the betterment of the regions. And therefore, if you recollect, in fact, Prime Minister Modi talked about Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives, and his whole idea about Indo-Pacific was that a region like this should be free, open, and inclusive. So therefore, India's mode of looking at Quad process and looking at the democratization within the Quad process are linked with its inclusive construct and linked it with transparency and opposed to unilateralism. That means what India is trying to pass within the Quad process to the regions is that we need to promote universalism against any kind of unilateralism. And I think there is also a couple of other things we need to talk about when we are talking about building a democratic synergy within the Quad and outside the Quad. And two specific issues I would like to point it out. One is how to bring together all the national planning of the Quad countries within the Quad framework. As the previous speaker Yuki-san pointed out about former Prime Minister Abe's initiatives. For example, EPQI, Expanded Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. India's Sagar concept, security and growth for all in the regions, which is an inclusive construct linked with the Indo-Pacific regions. The US initiatives like ARIA, the Asia Age, when we are talking about Blue Dot networks, which was actually introduced in the previous Trump administration. And then we are talking about building a collective synergy. We also need to think about how Australian initiatives and focus towards Pacific domain through Southeast Asian domain needs to be actually merged together. So bringing the respective national planning together is also going to add to the democratic synergy, and we need to really talk about it, how to proceed from now on. My last point would be, I think one critical point that the Quad countries needs to really talk about when they are talking about building democratic synergy within the Quad process and outside the Quad process, we need to also talk about influence operations. And this influence operation does not need to be coercive. This influence operation has to be in terms of protecting the regions not to become authoritarian. As I mentioned, that there are a number of regions in Southeast Asia, number of countries in Southeast Asia, they are not necessarily entirely democratic. And we need to convince these countries to fall into the democratic practice and not to go too much into the authoritarian ways. And I think India would like to see these issues being discussed within the Quad process further, and therefore India would like to keep on emphasizing a lot on an inclusive region, inclusive Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. All very insightful and really insightful and very productive discussion. And really would like to ask a question to cover both China and the Quad Plus. So for many Asian countries, the United States is the most important security partner, but China is their #1 trading partner, economic partner from most of the countries in the region. So we see, as all of you mentioned, we see diverse reactions from the regional stakeholders, and then the dilemma that they're not facing the reality that they cannot choose one over the other. And how would you respond to someone characterizing the Quad as an anti-China alliance, or like Lisa mentioned, that like something to contain China? And if that is understanding from the region, how should the Quad engage additional countries under the Quad Plus? And also like to, I'd like to come back to, Dr. Panda, you said issue specific. So should particular countries be brought into on specific issue sets, or should the goal be gradually build broad membership in the Quad so that it becomes like something like de facto multilateral cooperation, cooperative body in the Indo-Pacific? And I'd like to start with Ashley.
Thanks, Mia. Look, a lot of questions there. I just want to make one point on the democracy issue, and then I'll pick up on the last one there.
Sure.
Look, I agree with a lot of the points that were made, and again, just to be clear here, I think that the Quad absolutely has a role in investing in the region in ways that strengthen the principles, the governance principles in particular, that underpin our democracies, the democracies in our 4 countries. But that is a different project, related but different project to promoting democracy itself. And I think Lisa really hit it on the head when she said that the aim here is to strengthen sovereignty and resilience to Chinese coercion. That is at the front and center of Australia's 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which essentially singles that issue out, building regional resilience to Chinese coercion so that countries themselves have independent capacity to defend their interests, whether that be in the maritime domain or whether that be vis-a-vis disinformation or economic coercion. They have those independent capacities to be more resilient and to defend themselves against those sorts of encroachments on the regional order and on those polities themselves. But also, the second part of this, again, where I think there's a big role for the Quad, where Quad countries can themselves, or individually or as groups, provide direct support to countries in need, particularly in the midst of a crisis, whether that be a crisis with regards to economic coercion, as Australia is currently enduring, or whether that be in regards to a crisis such as the penetration of or exploitation of exclusive economic zones by a particular Southeast Asian country, where Quad countries, individually or in groups, can come in and provide intelligence, surveillance, can be present in ways that signal a degree of escalation risk if China were to be more kinetic in its actions on the water against certain regional claimants. These, I think, are key ways in which we can sort of tangibly reinforce sovereignty, tangibly reinforce resilience. And of course, with all the good points made about transparency, accountability, alternatives, you name it when it comes to infrastructure investment and other forms of governance promotion in the region, I think these are all very valuable policy initiatives for the Quad. I'm just not convinced that they necessarily need to be branded as a form of democracy promotion. And like I said at the start, I don't think this is necessarily a problem for the Quad yet, but I think at the policy level, it does need to be managed. And just a final point there is also to note that, you know, as uncomfortable as it is, there is a degree of tension between the statement that ASEAN centrality is at the heart of the Quad, on the one hand, or that inclusivity is a key principle, and the emphasis on democracy on the other hand. Those things can coexist in speeches and statements, but again, at the policy level, they become a little bit thorny, and I guess that's the issue to manage. Just quickly on that on the questions that you answered there in terms of should we be bringing other countries into the Quad, and how do we sort of think about and operationalize its China balancing agenda. I just want to zero in on the defense aspect of it here. What also happened in the last few months is that Australia was invited by India to take part in the Malabar naval exercises, and so it's actually for the second time because it happened once before, but we now have an annual Quad military maritime exercise in this case, which is significant and which undertakes significant forms of security cooperation and interoperability building, most notably in the context of anti-submarine warfare exercises. But there is a long road to travel, and I think we absolutely need to invest in it to go from an exercise such as that to being able to provide, let's say, a degree of credibility of the Quad as a whole when it comes to, let's say, anti-submarine warfare operations or deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. It's a very positive thing. We've now got 2 exercises that involve all 4 Quad members when it comes to ASW and maritime surveillance. We have many, many more when it comes to looking at the 2s and 3s involved within the Quad, which frankly is where a lot of the details of security cooperation and technical coordination will be worked out. But when it comes to any one of those dyads, you know, it's a long and difficult path to batter down the processes for combined operations, for combined intelligence, sensitive and classified intelligence sharing, communication, to say nothing about combined military planning. The Australia-United States alliance as a bilateral doesn't undertake combined military planning at this, and has never done, even as we've participated in joint operations and combined operations all around the world for 100 years. So there is a big step change that needs to be made, and I would wager that in order to operationalize that agenda, which will make the Quad over time credible as a provider of deterrence in the region, those policy steps need to begin and be accelerated at the bi- and trilateral levels first, building out to the Quad.
Thank you, Ashley. And Lisa, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Ashley, particularly on his last point about, you know, there is a need for security cooperation among the Quad, but each bilateral relationship or even trilateral is at a different stage. Of course, the US works on interoperability with Australia and Japan. India, you know, we have a ways to go. Of course, the US and India have made tremendous strides in their security and defense partnership. We've completed 4 defense enabling agreements, which were very critical to being able to operate more closely, share information. But there still is a ways to go. And even though the Quad will not emphasize the security cooperation, particularly publicly, you know, we're just not going to see that. I think that's obvious. But I think it is important for it to enter into the discussion, and particularly when we're talking about maritime domain awareness, maritime surveillance. And my hope is that the four countries will begin to delve into this issue because there is a necessity in order to deter China, as Ashley was talking about. It would be important for the four countries to start pooling their resources, increasing their data and information exchanges in order to be able to provide that maritime domain awareness that is so critical. In terms of other countries and their relationship with the Quad, I think this is a really important question. And the Quad should not be seen as an exclusive organization. Certainly, I think the four countries provide that core of the organization, but it's important for other countries to be able to be involved with Quad activities, to benefit from Quad activities, and to be able to provide consultation and advice. And I would just note that the previous administration did hold a series of biweekly meetings to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic in the early stages about a year ago. And it was Quad Plus, meaning it was the Quad countries plus South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. So we've already seen that other countries have come into the Quad or to cooperate with the Quad on an issue by issue basis. And I think this is very positive and something that should continue. And it gives other countries the choice of, how they want to be involved with the Quad. They wouldn't be forced to do anything or associate in any way that they're not comfortable with, but they have the option, and there's the flexibility to bring countries sort of in and out of working with the Quad. So I think that's important.
Thank you, Lisa. And now Yuki.
Yes, I really can't agree more with what Ash laid out in terms of the challenges as the four country really begins to operationalize those areas of cooperation, especially in the security and defense space. But and then in terms of but I think I would like to go back to the first occasion that the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia formed that the core group, if you will, of the cooperation was in a humanitarian assistance disaster relief area, which by training in those area has a lot of application to other more kinetic applicability to a little bit more kinetic situations as well. And at least in the US, Japan, Australia, and in a US, Japan, India, those trilateral framework, those exercises are happening. And from Japanese perspective, in next to United States, which obviously is the only treaty ally of Japan, Australia and India are the partners that Japan has, whose security and defense relationships are most institutionalized. Bilateral mechanism is there. Those are four defense cooperation enabling agreement that Lisa mentioned. Japan has already put those agreements in place with both India and Australia. So from Japanese perspective, on bilateral basis, those tools are already in place. And I think it is the matter of, as Ash and both Lisa and Ash pointed out, which area are we going to start expanding into? And this is where I think what Ash was referring to as perhaps rubber meets the road aspect might come into place in a little bit. But I think as far as the other, and then also less quickly for the other partners, Secretary Blinken was just visiting NATO, and at the speech that he made at NATO ministerial, he actually identifies security challenges from China as the big first category of the security threat that the NATO also should think of it as own. So major partners in NATO, such as France, Germany, and England, those three countries have all all begun to participate in the freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea. So those countries are probably natural partner that Quad can start reaching out to. And in the best of the circumstances, truly, South Korea really is also the natural partner. But it's just that current administration in Seoul seemed to be so focused on the reunification and the reconciliation with North Korea, which raised a tremendous challenge as the Quad looks for space to work with South Korea.
Thank you, Yuki. Jagannath?
Yes, I think more or less I agree with all these points that has been already made. But I think one big message that the Quad Leadership Summit has passed to China. Obviously, I do agree with the view that possibly there won't be any direct mention of China. But again, most of these messages are hinted towards China and directed towards China. Unless you are an alliance partner, and what we just saw in the recently released joint statement of the 2+2 between US and Japan, there is a mention about China. Normally in this kind of collective and joint statement, you don't mention a particular country, but most of these issues are directed against China. I think the biggest message that Quad Leadership Summit has given to the regions and also to the China, that it has in a way questioned Xi Jinping's core idea of building the community of shared future for humankind. I mean, here the Quad groupings are making a statement that we need to believe in transparency, democratic means, universalism, and we need to think in a collective mode of thinking. And I think that is the whole idea behind this Quad grouping at this moment. And this is what at this moment is coming out from the leadership summit. And I think the other thing is that what this leadership summit has done is that while they have talked about the three critical subgroups on critical and emerging technologies, climate change, vaccine experts groups, these are experts groups, study teams, and they are going to take forward the Quad process forging ground level cooperations. But what is actually the political intent behind these groupings are very big. It tried to pass a message that the regions needs to believe in collective leadership. No matter how strong an economy you are or how weaker an economy you are, you need to believe in collectivity in terms of trying to provide leadership, in terms of believe in transparency and universalism. And I think that's the key message. And what I think critical issue that is emerging from India's point of view, as it is already mentioned, I think is that with this Quad Leadership Summit, all the bilateral ties between India, US, India, Japan, India, Australia, and all the trilateral ties, India, US, Japan, and India, Japan, Australia, are in a way getting revitalized. It is giving a more purposive direction to this bilateral and trilateral oriented connections among the Quad countries. So I think that is another fulcrum, that is another hallmark of the Quad process, and the leadership summit has done it. And I think in the greater context of the regions, one significant point that is emerging is that the Quad has continuously been mentioning about maritime security, freedom of navigation, rule of law. And I think with this Quad process, when we are actually talking about growth and development, when we are talking about capacity building, when we are talking about technologies, climate, issues of soft security networks, there is a need to talk about one more critical element, that is the green economy, green marine economy. And I think that would interest all the four countries, particularly to India, because India is still an emerging economy. Unlike the three economies, which are primarily, let's say, developed economies to some extent, India is still an emerging economy. India would like to cooperate with the three other Quad economies to talk about, green economy, marine economy, and to take it forward and trying to, forge a cooperative framework between hard security and soft security. And I think that's what India is looking at in terms of also building its synergy with all the Quad members bilaterally, with the US, with Japan, and with Australia in last few years.
Thank you. And I just see that this is such a timely, topic, so that we have so many topics to cover. But unfortunately, we're out of time. We're running out of the time. So I really want to take questions from the audience. And let me ask you this final question. I really would appreciate if you make your comment really brief. So one question from the audience. So can the Quad work for furthering nuclear arms control in the Indo-Pacific region together with NATO and other countries which share the same interest and concern? And also my final question is, if you have any policy suggestions in terms of the working group on climate change and technology, because compared to the working group on the vaccine, we have less details. So just please answer either question given the interest of time, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. And maybe I can turn to Ashley first.
Of course, thanks very much. I'll be brief. Look, I certainly think that Quad countries have shared interests when it comes to nuclear arms control and the strength of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are myriad complications as well with getting coordinated action in terms of Indo-Pacific arms control. I'll leave it to others to get into the details separately or on other occasions. But I think perhaps a more feasible objective for the Quad when it comes to the issues of arms control might be to start working with NATO countries at establishing and thinking about standards for new and emerging defense technologies, areas where there isn't already the fraught issues that we have with US, China, India, other countries in the Indo-Pacific working together on arms control, where that's a difficult problem. When we're thinking to the future and weapon systems or potential weapon systems that are currently ungoverned completely, and which all 4 Quad countries as well as NATO counterparts will be jointly involved in creating not just platforms of, but rules to govern international order with regards to those new platforms. That is a productive agenda, I think, for the Quad.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit skeptical on the Quad getting involved in arms control issues at this point. They seem to have so many other agenda items to deal with, and we've seen the 3 most important issues that they're establishing the working groups for: technology, critical technologies, climate change, and vaccination production and distribution. So I think that the arms control issue doesn't really factor in, at least in the immediate term. And if you look at some of the important nuclear issues, if you look at the North Korea issue, it's clear the US is going to try to work with Japan and South Korea on this issue. They're holding the meeting next week in Washington with the Japanese and South Korean leaders to look specifically at North Korea. So I see the arms control issue as a bit out of the ambit of the Quad. With regard to the other issues that are important to deal with, I've already talked about the importance of critical and emerging technologies and what the Quad can do on those issues in particular. Just to mention the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which of course Japan, India, and Australia agreed to. They signed a statement announcing the initiation of this supply chain group. And I think it would be important for the US to kind of become involved in that as well. So that is something that certainly they can start to build on in the Quad, is the supply chain resilience issue. And I think one other issue that I just want to throw out there before we finish is, I think it's very important for the Quad to think about working together to help the Southeast Asian nations recover economically. Of course, right now, the immediate need is the vaccinations, but soon attention will shift to their economic recovery because of all the problems that have been experienced because of the pandemic. So I think, those are some of the important issues to me that are more immediate and lend themselves better to Quad cooperation than arms control.
Thank you, Lisa and Yuki.
Yes, in the question about the Quad's potential of collaborate on the arms control, rather than arms control per se, because leveraging on one of the working group, which is emerging and a critical technology, it would be more prudent for Quad grouping to start discussing a non-proliferation of those emerging technologies. It seems to me that much more productive discussion can be had, not amongst the only amongst the four countries, but then this is definitely has a potential of productive conversation and specific cooperation items with major NATO countries and some other partners. So I would just stop there.
Thank you, Yuki and Dr. Panda.
Yes, I think we should not really overemphasize the hard security component, try to talk about nuclear issues or arms control at this moment, because with the leadership summit, there is a new beginning has started with the Quad process. We need to capitalize on the issues that are urgent for the regions. And therefore, we need to focus on building capacity, growth and development, and trying to focus on how to build a good network of communications among the four countries and build synergy in the regions in terms of trying to find out a new framework for the supply chain resilience initiatives. But I think at the same time, we should not entirely be dismissing the hard security component, because there is an elephant in the room, and we should be mindful about the way it is actually acting towards the regions on the China-India border issues, on the Senkaku Island issues, on the South China Sea, on the Taiwan issue. The Chinese portion has been really questionable. So I think what we need to do, instead of trying to promote a kind of a arms control initiatives within the Quad process, we need to really strengthen the military and security components among the Quad countries. And this is what India is doing with the United States. We had the BECA, the fourth foundational agreement, apart from JISMUA, LEMOA, CAMCASA, ISA. So I think we should be building synergy bilaterally in order to strengthen the security networks within the Quad process. And I think that will serve the Quad more purposefully in the regions, rather than really talking about the arms connections and going for the military connections in the region.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us for today's conference on the future of the US-Japan alliance under Biden and Suga. And really, and special thanks to our distinguished panelists, and really for sharing your insights, and especially on the set of important issues and these opportunities and challenges that our alliances faces, and including how we can work through multilateral framework. And we talk a lot about how to operationalize the Quad. So we will continue our important work on US-Japan alliance and this broader set of issues, including the Quad. And next week, we have an event on US-Japan cooperation on global supply chains. So thank you so much again, and please stay tuned, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.